Right, very good. Thank you so much. I would like to really thank all of you for coming today and sharing this hour and a half of our lives together. I hope that the presentation will be meaningful for you, both personally and professionally. Before we begin, I just want to say this is my very vulnerable and humble attempt to synthesize much of what I've learned over the past several years through various certification classes and listening to countless webinars and seminars with great teachers and watching countless YouTubes and reading books and so on. I was first certified as an alcohol and drug counselor back in the late 80s, and I am thankful for how far we have come. I remember the days of hearing about therapeutic approaches like giving an inpatient resident who broke a house rule a toothbrush to scrub the bathroom floor. In those days, shame and blame, maybe with the best intentions, causing our clients to feel less than they already felt, was part of the treatment path. You know, it was like, if I shame you enough, maybe you'll shape up. I don't know if anybody else remembers those days. So we have, thank goodness, we have evolved immensely from those days, and our field of addictions and mental health and behavioral health are continuing to evolve on a wonderful new trajectory. And we continue to be open to the wonders of neuroscience and the yet untapped capabilities and dimensions of our brains. And so maybe we can continue to go forward like Captain Kirk, where nobody has ever gone before. So this is why I thought it might be a wonderful time to get together and reflect on the old and the new. I am not endorsing any one way. This presentation is really meant to be an exploration of ideas and concepts and skills and options that have touched me and helped me to go into a deeper archaeological dig into connecting trauma and addiction, and also to feel it more in the body, in the mind, and the heart, and then be able to bring forth much more wisdom and compassion as we guide and support others. So during this presentation, please take care of yourself. I'm aware that the topics are sensitive to us personally and professionally. If someone comes to your mind as we're going through this, just take note of that. It might open some windows or doors to understanding. And if we learn something new about ourselves, that's a good thing too, right? So we have lots of in the interest of time, we might have to skip some, but we will get the slides and the PowerPoint and everything else, so everything can be covered. So with all that said, let's begin the exploration of trauma and addiction. All right, so we begin with this saying, all that you touch, you change. And all that you change, changes you. And the only lasting truth is change. Right, so the growth that happens. And before we totally begin, just a little heartfelt message to all of us who are here. You can trust that any person in your care has experienced some form or degree of trauma in their lifetime, and everyone deserves trauma-informed and addiction-informed care, sensitivity, compassionate care, and attention, and to be treated, of course, with dignity and loving kindness. So just to take a couple of deep breaths as we remember all the victims of trauma and addiction, those that we have worked with, those that we are working with now, those that we will work with in the future, as well as to remember ourselves. Some of us, I'm sure, have also some of these memories. So just a breath or two to think about that. And to move forward to the goals of the training, which was to bring to our understanding how trauma can interfere with one's ability to function physically, mentally, socially, emotionally to one's full potential, and to be able to reflect upon our definitions of addiction and trauma and explore the relationship that exists between these two, to highlight past, present, and future treatment modalities for the healing of addiction and trauma, and also to reflect how these informed practices can really help foster resiliency and empowerment for those that are seeking recovery. If we want to understand the oak, it's back to the acorn we must go. Right? So going back to the beginning. And I thought we would start with just like 2 or 3 minutes of asking you to either just reflect or write, if you'd like, to start as a baseline before we really jump into the material. What is your current definition of addiction? And to think about what are some of your subjective thoughts and experiences and feelings about addiction, your experiences with it, either personally or professionally or indirectly through family, friend, and so on. And then to also do the same thing for your current definition of trauma. What are some of your subjective thoughts, experiences, and feelings about trauma? So just to spend a moment or two just thinking about that. And if you want to just jot down a few words, or sense even how it feels in your body and your mind when you hear these words. For so much of the new treatment approaches have to do with the somatics of our experience, how the body is experiencing it, the sensations that come, the memories that come, and so on. I'll just give you another minute or so. Knowing you can write books on this, I'm sure, but just to get a sense of where we are at this starting point. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on, but you can always go back to that. Right? Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry, I went backwards here. Okay. So we're going to start with the self-portrait of a young mother entering treatment. And this was my beginning. This was going back to the late 80s. I was working in a residential treatment program, had not even hardly taken my first courses yet in addiction treatment. And what we would have the clients do when they first came into the program was give them a really big piece of paper and ask them to draw a self-portrait. And this young woman came into the program, right, from the streets. And you could see the little figure there in the corner. That's what she did on this big piece of paper. She drew a little stick figure. And I remember saying to myself, if that figure could walk off the page, it would. It doesn't even want to be on this paper. And suddenly a door opened to me, to all that I could before never really understand or reconcile about addiction. I never forgot that woman who drew that little stick figure as her self-portrait. 3 months later, it's time for discharge, and she was given another big piece of paper, right? And this time her discharge self-portrait was totally filled with pastel colors. She covered the whole page. She had a picture of herself sitting under a tree with her 3 daughters, and there were all apples on the tree, a grass-covered hill. There was a stream of water running through the whole page. There was the sun shining, there were clouds and birds in the sky. And, you know, I can't help but ask, like, what happened in those 3 months? What happened? Those 2 pictures were so diametrically opposite to one another. And it was a wonderful, heartwarming thing to see. So let's go back basic core needs were met when she entered into treatment. I know you all know Maslow's scale and so on. Our basic core needs of safety and love and connection and belonging. And we know that when these needs are met, we are feeling okay. We have a sense of equanimity and balance and resiliency and empowerment. And when they're not met, we are pretty miserable. We get lonely and depressed and scared and fearful, and we blame and we shame and can get depressed and so on when basic needs are not met. So let's always keep these basic core needs in our mind as we go through this presentation. Gabor Mate, he emphasizes two fundamental needs. He talks about the essentialness of the attachment needs of the young infant, parent, and child, and the need for authenticity. And he describes attachment as that sense of bonding and belonging to yourself as well as to others. And he truly believes that without attachment, we just cannot survive. Without attachment, the endorphins that our brain is able to develop to help us as we move forward in those first early days, weeks, months of life, without attachment, those endorphins cannot develop, and it starts to cause damage to our brain. He also emphasizes the importance of authenticity, being connected to ourselves, knowing what we really feel and think, and then being able to act on that without fear and without any sense that we're going to lose basic core needs or lose that person that we're attached to. So without attachment, there is no life, is what Gabor says. This attachment drive is the source of all pathology, whether physical or mental, when those needs are not met. And authenticity, that sense of being ourselves and being in touch with our own gut feelings, it's really a survival need. So that if in my gut, I know that there's danger, I react to that danger, and I don't pretend that everything is okay. It's like you're really in touch with who you are and what you are truly feeling. And with the lack of attachment and the lack of authenticity, unfortunately, these core wounds begin to develop. And there is a sense of abandonment and loss of love and loss of belonging and loss of safety and betrayal and trauma and shame and so on. All of these things that are actually the opposite of the core needs being met. And then we add to that the adverse childhood experiences that people have in their life, the adverse community environments, add that as well to a child that's growing up. And you can see why there is so much difficulty and why there is such a pervasiveness of trauma and such a pervasiveness of pain and suffering and that sense of disconnection from the self. So there are many, many things that block us from that self-love. If you look at this slide here with all the different kinds of experiences people can have, and the suitcase that we carry wherever we go, you know, this suitcase of abandonment and mistrust and lack of nurturing. And it's just the lens that we begin to develop, the way that we begin to look at the world, the way we feel we can trust or not trust others, and so on. And also where we have a sense of our place in the world. You know, how big are the boulders that are in the way from our moving forward in our life? And I would like to talk a little bit here about that journey of brain development, actually from in utero, and then especially in those early years of life. This work is taken from the book, What Happened to You, by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And it's a book I really recommend. It has the most complicated things written in beautiful layman's language to be able to understand what is actually happening to the brain, what is the neuroscience of all of these experiences. And it begins with this understanding that we start at the bottom in our growth, the brain stem, the oldest part of our body, of our brain, which takes care of all the autonomic functions, the breathing, respiration, and so on, all of the things that allow us to survive. And then the midbrain begins to develop, and that involves movement and regulation and sensory information and things of that nature. And then we move up to the limbic system. That begins to develop, where we begin to form memory and emotional connections and attachment and that sense of belonging, all those things that are so important for healthy development. And then the last part of our brain that actually develops is that prefrontal cortex, right? The cerebral cortex, which has to do with all of our intellectual functioning, our reasoning, all of the skills to make good decisions and to have resiliency and empowerment and so on. And that's the last part of the brain that develops. Now, what happens here when there is a lot of stress in those very early days, weeks, months, years, a lot of stress on the body and on the brain, it truly affects the developing child. And that is going to move on unless there is some wonderful, healthy interventions. It's going to move on, something that they're going to carry into adulthood. So when the environment, the surrounding environment is unpredictable or extreme, where there's abuse and neglect and so on, when it's prolonged, when there is no ceasing, this is like a chronic state of dysregulation, what happens is the responses become overactive and reactive because the person is in fight, flight, or freeze. They're always scared and they're always on guard. When the environment is healthy, then our brain is exposed to an energy field that is predictable and moderate, controllable. It's nurturing, everything can be regulated. And the child begins to develop with a greater sense of flexibility and resiliency, tolerance, and those needed endorphins that help us to regulate are able to be produced and they're able to function. We put them into practice with the guidance of nurturing parents who also give us coping strategies and guide us through the ups and downs of what we are experiencing. So in one instance, the response system becomes very maladaptive. In the other, in the healthy environment, our brain response system, our nervous system becomes very adaptive, and we're able to function and to survive. Even when things might cause us to get out of balance, we're able to restabilize again. And this slide, I really love this slide because it just shows the difference between a typical development of a healthy child, of a well-adapted child, and then what developmental trauma does. If you can see, the two triangles are upside down, right? In typical development, as we develop, we spend less and less time on survival because the survival needs are being fulfilled. I'm eating okay, I'm breathing okay, my heart is beating good, I'm safe, I'm in a trusted environment, and so on. Now I can focus my energy on regulation and I can continue to climb up that triangle and be able to, develop all these different systems in our brain. However, notice if there's developmental trauma, then much more time for that young child is spent in survival mode and having to try to regulate themselves as best as they can, not knowing what to do, and often just being in states of fear or stress, which cause them to feel disconnected from themselves or for others. And you can see then there is also less energy available for social and emotional development, and there's less energy left for the prefrontal cortex to develop its skills and all of its executive functioning for decision making and coping strategies and having a greater context in which to navigate one's life. So I hope that explains a lot about what happens to those that are more exposed to trauma and how much more energy it takes for them to just survive. Okay. And I'd like to share this little story. This is taken from Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. And what this is a drawing of a 5-year-old boy who had witnessed the attack on the World Trade Centers. He was let out of the school that very day, and the school was right by the buildings. Luckily, his father and other brother were there, and the parents came rushing in, of course, and taking the kids home and so on. What interested Bessel about this picture was that this picture was drawn the day after 9/11. It was drawn on September 12th. And the little boy just, sadly, right, depicted what he saw, the plane going into the building, people falling, and so on. What struck Bessel's attention was that at the bottom, what he had drawn in when Bessel asked, what are those little things at the bottom? And what the little boy said is that they were mats. They were nice mats placed there so that when the people fell, they wouldn't get hurt. And Bessel was really struck by that and by the way the boy was, and his adaptability to what he had experienced. And what he put together was some of the resiliency skills that this little boy had from one day to the next. First of all, he was able to run away from the scene with his father and his brother. So he was an active agent in his own rescue, right? Agency, self-agency is so essential when it comes to any kind of trauma. He was not immobilized, which Bessel says is at the root of most traumas. He and his family, luckily, were unharmed. They were surrounded by the love of one another. In the book, he describes how they talked about it and processed it and so on. And also, the boy was able to calm himself. He drew the picture the next day, and he even imagined a creative alternative to what he had seen, a life-saving trampoline for people so that they would be okay. So in this simple slide, what is depicted here are some of the essential ingredients that are preventative for trauma, right? And we're going to talk more about that. But I thought that you would be interested in seeing this little piece about Noam and his drawing. Okay. So now to go back a little bit in time, like we said, this class is about past, present, and future. Trauma is not new. Just very quickly on this slide, I'm going to just jump through it. In the 18th and 19th century, Western medicine used the term hysteria for this condition. And in those days, they reserved it for women. Thank you very much, right? It was really a diagnosis given to women. Pierre Janet in 1911, very interesting in his work with patients, he wrote something that could have been written today. He wrote that he saw these patients unable to integrate their traumatic memories. They seemed to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences, as if their personality has definitely stopped at a certain point. And that is one of the things that happens with intense trauma, that inability to integrate, to live in the present moment and being frozen in time. And then Freud came along and he advanced some of his ideas, but then he walked back on them as well because they were not socially acceptable at the time. And so that set things back a little bit. And then we have the world wars, where finally there is a recognition that those soldiers who they had what they called then shell shock, combat exhaustion, and so on, not only happened to those that had actually experienced the physical warfare, but those who were in psychological distress as well. And that was the beginning, actually, of humane and caring and psychological treatment. Before that, soldiers were shamed if they had experienced some of any of these signs of trauma, flashbacks, fear, and so on, nightmares, things like that. They were considered weak, but finally it was given the place that it deserved, in terms of honoring it as a disorder. And then one of the greatest movements forward was the Vietnam movement, of course, with the returning veterans when they came back. And all of their experiences led to a greater study of trauma. They lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to create a new disorder, and that became PTSD. And so psychological trauma in that sense became very real and began to open the gates to the legitimacy for continued research and understanding of what trauma is. a very brief history, but just to know that it's something that's been around for sure, and it's evolved in its terms of acceptance and understanding. And now I'd like to go through a couple of different trauma definitions by the experts. I'm not going to read all of it, you'll have it, but just that you get a sense of this. And I'd like to invite you to try to get a body sense as well as a, intellectual and cognitive sense of these words that these wonderful people who have studied trauma and researched it so well, what they have come to know. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk says trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's an imprint that's left by that experience on the mind, the brain, and the body, right? The person has a different nervous system after they have experienced trauma. And for real change to take place, not only intellectually does the person need to know that the trauma is not happening in this moment, but their body has to know that. And that's where a lot of the work is happening now in somatic therapies and things like that, because you might know that you're not in a minefield or a war zone right now, but your body is still going to be reacting as if it were. So that's an important understanding. Okay, Pat Ogden says, trauma refers to any threatening, overwhelming experience that we cannot integrate. And after these experiences, we're left with a diminished sense of security with ourselves, with others, and in the world, and feeling unsafe within our own skin, right? And I used to think that, trauma was only if something really awful happened, surviving a plane crash or a car crash or being part of an active shooting experience or something. But I've come to learn that there are those big T traumas and little t traumas, and that all traumas matter. And that you don't only need one big T trauma, but lots of little t traumas happening chronically on a daily basis have the same kind of effect as a big T trauma. So, this work has really helped me broaden my context and understanding of who can experience trauma. Okay, Resmaa Menakem, who his book, My Grandmother's Hands, he describes trauma as a response to anything that's overwhelming, anything that happens too much, too fast, too soon, too long, and coupled with a lack of protection and support. And again, there's the mention of how it lives in the body. It's stored in the body as sensation, pain, or tension, or a lack of sensation, like a numbness or frozenness. So either one of those can happen. And Gabor Mate, who has done so much work on trauma, he describes the word trauma as the Greek word for wound. So it's a psychic wound, and it pains you, and you're acting out of pain, and you're full of fear, so you're acting out of fear. And again, it disconnects us from ourself, from our sense of value, and from the present moment. It really becomes the lens through which we see the world. And I'm sure many of you have already heard this wonderful shift that has taken place in our field, that instead of saying what's wrong with you to our clients, to our patients, instead the question is, what happened to you? And Gabor says trauma is not the bad thing that happened to you, but it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. It's a disconnect from self because it is too painful to be ourselves. And important for us to understand how every statistic is a person. I did look up some of these statistics about trauma in our world and found it overwhelming that more than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. In the United States, 1 in 5 women will be raped. 70 to 90% of US adults have experienced some kind of trauma once in their lives. And then I know we're all focused on the school shootings. Since 1999, more than 350,000 students have experienced gun violence in 380 schools. And imagine beyond those who were killed or wounded, those who witnessed the violence and those who are just scared, who are hiding, and their families, and all of those that are even more indirectly affected by it. There were more school shootings in 2022. There were 46 of them, more than in any year since 1999, when they first started keeping track of all of these with Columbine. And in 2021, the statistics say 1 in 5 adolescents are suffering from major depressive disorder, and suicide is the second most common cause of death for youth aged 15 to 24. So if ever there was a need to understand trauma, for sure, statistics like these let us know that many people that we are meeting in our everyday life are suffering from this. And how trauma is experienced. So there are 4 ways: when we directly experience it, when we witness one, a traumatic event, when we experience or share an event that occurred to someone very close to us, when we're right there doing the comforting and the supporting, and when we have repeated exposure to trauma, when it is something that is chronic over and over again. So those are the various ways that somebody can be impacted by trauma. And Resmaa Menakem and many others talk about the many different kinds of trauma that are also intersecting and flowing into people at the same time. And it's not that these are all in, separate boxes and we can treat one and then we'll go to the other. It's like, no, everything's kind of interwoven now. And so we want to understand that there is historical trauma from generations past, in the intergenerational trauma from our parents and grandparents, institutional trauma, persistent institutional trauma that we all witness every day. Then our own personal trauma, vicarious trauma by witnessing others, and complex trauma, which we'll describe in a second, which is when there's more than one trauma, when there's a trauma in childhood and then another trauma on top of that and on top of that. And this recent studies in neuroscience have also shown us that trauma actually can damage the genes in our cells, and that damage is passed down from parent to child, and from the child to his or own child. They are actually finding the scientific evidence for this so-called rite of passage of trauma from one generation to the next. And there are a bunch of influences that impact the effect of these experiences upon trauma. And I'll go through them quickly. There's the history of previous trauma. If you've had previous trauma, childhood, war, or sexual violence, racism, any of the ACEs and so on. Then if you have another trauma, it's tremendously compounded. History of mental health problems. If you have previous depression or anxiety, substance abuse, if you have another trauma on top of that, it's going to make it even, more problematic. Then the proximity to the event for oneself or closeness to the significant others. Where were you when this was happening? Sometimes, even if you weren't there, it's very traumatic. I was listening to the parents at Uvalde School recently, and what it was like for them to be standing outside that school building, right? And so close to the event and not being able to do anything about it, and how they are suffering from guilt and all kinds of other post-traumatic stress disorders. When trauma occurs in the early years, there's a greater impact. The earlier the trauma occurs, the deeper the imprint, which is kind of interesting. And the reason for that is because when you're older, you have probably developed a little bit more resiliency, maybe a little bit greater context of life and so on. But if you're in your early years of childhood, there is no other context except what you are currently living. There's nothing else to go to. So the imprint of the trauma in the body and in the mind is actually greater than when you are older. All right, also the unavailability of compassionate and trauma-informed support. If no one is there to help you or guide you, if you have no one to talk to, if you keep this a secret, for a really long time, or maybe forever, that trauma has no way to dissipate itself. It just stays frozen again in the body and the mind. Another influence is when it's unexpected, like 9/11 or that collapse of that Florida apartment building or sudden death makes it much more impactful as well. Also, if it lasts a long time, if it repeats itself multiple times, how long the event is happening, how long are people suffering, the person's individual temperament and whether they have adaptive or maladaptive resources to deal with what's going on, involves the death of many. For example, when there's massive earthquakes or floods or mass shootings, the more deaths, the greater the trauma. And that sense of immobilization, no agency, no protection for oneself. And then if one has undeveloped protective skills, if one's ability to problem solve or express emotions and so on, if all of those kinds of things are happening, well, then absolutely the trauma can be greater. And then finally, person's biology, just their nervous system, how it is formed and so on, any history of drug abuse and genetics as well. So lots of different factors. So when we see our clients, we want to realize that there's all these many intersections that are happening to them in their life, right? This is the work of David Cervelli, who is an expert on trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And what he talks about is that this is actually a little chart of the spectrum of trauma, that 90 to 100% of us have some kind of trauma in the form of stress, just regular stress, traumatic stress that comes and goes, that might not be so terrible, but we survive it. Then there's traumatic stress. And then the next most serious form is post-traumatic stress. And then on to the next level, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is about 3.5% of the population. So I'm going to describe each of those very, very simply and quickly. So regular old stress, right, can be positive or negative. It is the response of the body to any demand for change. It could be happy change, could be a sad change. Body goes through stress. We experience it every day in many different ways, and then we bring our body back to an equilibrium, right? And we feel balanced and okay, back to center. Then there is traumatic stress, which is the response to shocking and emotionally overwhelming situations that can involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, that we feel that we're going to get hurt or others are going to get hurt, or our sense of safety is really on the line. What happens then is that gets changed into post-traumatic stress disorder if the trauma stress lasts longer, more than a month, or if it recurs at least 6 months after the event, then it's considered post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a little bit more serious, right? There's intrusions, constant intrusions, thoughts, memories, flashbacks, sensations, a desire to avoid anything that would remind the person of the event, right? Not being able maybe to go to a store, or not being able to drive a car, whatever that experience is. Arousal and reactive symptoms, the nervous system really starts to react, hypervigilant, fight, flight, or freeze. One becomes disassociated. It could even get worse where a person can feel completely depersonalized and have a kind of dissociative amnesia as well. So you can see that the post-traumatic stress disorder just raises the notch a whole lot. And like I said before, it's diagnosed if the traumatic stress symptoms last more than a month or continue to occur after the event. And the final category is complex PTSD. And this is with repeated and prolonged extensive exposure to traumatic events like war hostages and battering victims, cult survivors, sexual abuse, domestic violence victims. Okay. I think I'd like to show you here our first YouTube to have a little explanation by Peter Levine, who has done tremendous work working with trauma in the body. So I stopped you. Just bear with me a minute. Here we go. Okay. Angie has it. Just, okay.
I have a prop that I carry with me just for these reasons, and it kind of illustrates what happens in trauma. Okay, this represents our energy, our arousal level, and so we're just taking a walk, and our energy is, you know, basically moving like this, up and down. If we're taking a run, there's more movement in our energy. If somebody's chasing us and threatening us, then our energy is really excited. Now, what happens in trauma is that we have this tremendous excitation, and then, boom, we're overwhelmed. This energy becomes locked. It becomes stuck in our bodies and our nervous systems. When this arousal, this activation, this hyperarousal doesn't get released, it leads to all kinds of symptoms, not only the classic symptoms of PTSD like flashbacks and nightmares, which Ray experiences, but to many physical sensations, physical symptoms, chronic pain, chronic stiffness in different parts of the body.
What is the key to resolving trauma?
First, we have to recognize that trauma has emotional effects, it has a cognitive effects, but primarily it's a physiological process. And until we begin to resolve it at the physiological level, it's not possible to resolve the emotional and the meaning issues that that traumatized people have. One of the conundrums in trauma therapy is that therapists are trained and are usually very good at being empathic. And with many clients, that really helps them settle enough to be able to work with their issues. When a person is deeply traumatized, the ability to read others' emotions by their faces and their postures is very much compromised, so that they're really not able to take into that the empathy. And often clients even feel like they've done something wrong because they're not able to take in that soothing, to take in the kindness of the therapist. And then equally, the therapist is often very frustrated because they don't know why what they're doing isn't working. The traumatized nervous system can't take too much activation, as I illustrated with the slinky, because they're overwhelmed, they're easily overwhelmed. And so it has to be done one dose at a time, one small experiential quantum. And an analogy that I use is what happens when you take a strong acid and a base. If you put them together, there's a tremendous explosion. However, if you take one drop of the base and add it to the acid, there's a little bit of an Alka-Seltzer fizzle, and then it quiets down, and then another drop, and then finally it's neutralized. It's neutralized, but without the explosion. And this is what you see with Ray and with traumatized clients in working this way, is that they come to rest, they come to equilibrium, and their life energy is restored to them. And for me, any trauma therapy really isn't successful until the person reowns their life energy and lives within their life energy.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yes. Okay. I hope you found that as interesting as I did, and I probably will never look at a slinky again the same. So Peter Levine is a great one to listen to and to read on in terms of the new kinds of therapies and working with trauma. He talks about how those who suffer from PTSD feel like there's a monster of some kind trapped and living inside of them with all of these different gut-wrenching sensations and so on. And he talks about how trauma victims really need a protective shield when they confront or face their own inner world of thoughts and memories. He compares this to that Greek story of Medusa when Perseus had to cut off the head of the Medusa, and in order to face that enemy, but what he did was he had a shield and he saw the reflection of the Medusa's face in his shield, because if he looked right at the Medusa, he would turn to stone. But being able to have his shield and seeing the image of the Medusa in the shield, he could accomplish his task and move on, and he would not get hurt. So that's why it's called the Medusa story in that way. And the protective shield is really about the trauma-informed care that we need to give to our clients, and the compassion and the different healing interventions that we can use to protect the client from re-victimization. Okay. See, it's not. Oh, I'm sorry. Here, I lost that. Sorry about that. It wasn't moving.
Oh. Tell them, give me 1 second.
Just 1 second, please. A little technical upset here. Okay, okay. All right. Almost had a traumatic moment there, right? Okay. All right. So trauma-informed care is what is needed, right? And it's important that sentence at the bottom of that heart, trauma is a risk factor for nearly all behavioral health and substance use disorders. So we're going to find it. We're going to find it there. And what is trauma-informed care? I felt that it's also addiction-informed care. These are the things that are essential, 6 core principles: assuring the client's safety, that client can walk into that room and be able to know where the exit is and to feel safe in that environment. Empowering the client to feel that they can trust you by your trustworthiness and your transparency, your integrity, your honesty, that they can feel comfortable with you and know that you're a trusted other for them. To have peer support and mutual self-help, being with others, of course, who have been through the same kinds of experiences and being able to relate to one another on that very deep level. Lots of collaboration and mutuality, helping the person to navigate through the system for the help that they need, collaborating with lots of different providers and caretakers. The person needs to have a sense of their own voice, and their choice is so important. It's what they want to do. It's what they're ready to face. It's what they're ready to talk about, not what we want them to do. It's all about them and so on. And also to be very sensitive to their cultural and historical and gender issues, being, again, very aware of the authenticity of the person that's in front of us. So all of these are involved in trauma-informed, and I believe addiction-informed treatment: safety, choice, respectful engagement. Unfortunately, many of our systems of care create triggers if we are too controlling or too structured or too inflexible, or if we don't guide them and help them understand. If everybody could mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you. Right. To allow the client to have that self-agency and the control, all right, of that they're, driving the car here and we're in the passenger seat in a way. It's important for us to ask, what do they need? What do they desire? And how far do they think they would like to go today? What would it be like for them, if finally they could be in control? So to create these kind of recovery models that honor also, of course, their culture and their background, their interest, things that they enjoy doing, things that can bring life back to them, right? Hobbies and sports or exercises or other kinds of activities that motivate them, that they can find some happiness and some motivation in. And I gathered together here some of the various healing modalities for trauma and addiction that are coming forth, because as wonderful as talk therapy can be, for trauma and probably also for addiction, it's not the only thing, and it may not even be the best thing if it's the only thing that we're doing. In the work with Bessel van der Kolk and Body Keeps the Score and other trauma specialists and somatic therapists, these are some of the things that are on the horizon that people are doing now, and we need to learn more. We all need to get training in a lot of these different kinds of modalities. They talk about the importance of movement, of dance, of drumming, rhythmic interactions, that we are creatures of movement. Our bodies need to move. And when our bodies move and stir the energy, that can help us emotionally and psychologically as well. So being much more physical, yoga, Tai Chi, martial arts, all of those change the physiology of the body. Being able to sing or vocalize in some way, psychodrama, other kinds of activities, soothing activities. Tapping, EFT, EMDR, brain spotting, somatic experiences, therapies, all of these different kinds of new modalities that work with the brain in a very special way. Also, what's really been coming up a lot in a lot of the literature I'm seeing, you're seeing it maybe as well, the therapeutic and guided use of psychedelics for trauma treatment and even maybe for serious substance abuse treatment, depending on the person. But MDMA, ayahuasca, ketamine, psilocybin, different kinds of plant medicines. And this requires, of course, therapists who are going to be specifically trained in the use of these modalities. This is not something to be taken lightly. It is not something that we just send somebody home with a tablet, as we will know. These are really serious efforts when all else is not working and a new doorway needs to be opened somehow, that this is seriously being considered, and many people are being helped by this. But of course, again, it takes a lot of care and a lot of education on the part of the therapist to get to know how to use these modalities. The building of trust is essential. And then many other kinds of mindfulness activities, meditation, self-compassion, working with other therapeutic models like internal family systems, compassionate inquiry, compassion-focused therapy, DBT. There are so many different types of therapies now, body-oriented techniques. So I guess, what I'm feeling is I owe it to myself as well as to our clients to look into some of these things, to learn them. And if I don't know how to do them, definitely to maybe refer clients to those that are certified and very knowledgeable in these types of activities. Okay, so I'd really like to emphasize that as well. Right. And going on now to kind of join addiction and trauma, mental illness together. All right. These were some of the addiction and mental illness statistics that I found that just really, again, kind of overwhelmed me. According to SAMHSA, 46.3 million people in the United States aged 12 or older met the DSM criteria for having a substance use disorder in the past year. Now, I did see other statistics from different sources that said it was like 20 million, but I kept checking and checking, and SAMHSA and several sites had this number of 46.3 million people meet criteria in the DSM-5 now for substance use disorder. 30 million for alcohol use disorder, 24 million for drug use disorder. In 2021, there were over 106,000 overdose deaths in the United States due to illicit drugs, prescription opioids. And drug overdose per 100,000, that's 32.1 persons. So all of these, again, these statistics, we have to remember, they're all people. In 2021, 94% of people aged 12 or older with a substance use disorder did not receive treatment. So there are so many out there who are not getting the help that they need. And nearly 1 to 3 adults had either a substance use disorder or a mental illness disorder in the past year. And finally, one last statistic, 46% of young adults, it's almost half, between the ages of 18 and 25, had either a substance use disorder or any mental illness. So these are amazing numbers, the scary numbers, and it's showing how many people are there in our communities who are in need of this kind of help. Also took a look at the ACEs and trauma as a risk factor for nearly all behavioral health and substance use disorders. All right, those who had 5 or more ACEs were 7 to 10 times greater risk for substance abuse. Researchers found that nearly 2/3 of injection drug use can be attributed to abusive and childhood traumatic experiences. And alcohol consumption had a similar pattern. Those who suffered sexual abuse were 3 times more likely to begin drinking in adolescence. And ACE researchers also said that the consumption of alcohol absolutely used as a means to self-regulate negative or painful emotions. So there's the connection again between trauma and addiction. And I'd like to share these quotes from people that we know of. Russell Brand said this one, "Drugs and alcohol are not my problem." He said, "Reality is my problem, and drugs and alcohol are my solution." And that's a totally different way for us to approach addiction and substance use treatment, right? Where our clients are actually using this, method of drugs and alcohol as a way to help themselves, right? From the pain that they are experiencing, from the trauma. Dr. Bruce Perry says there is a correlation between addiction and trauma. Most people are not taking drugs for the reasons we think. It's not about self-indulgence or pleasure-seeking or even a desire to escape life in general, as much as it is about avoiding the pain and the distress of dysregulation in their bodies. And finally, a quote by Gabor Mate again, "Addiction," he says, "is an attempt to solve a problem. It is the symptom of deeper malaise, in most cases, trauma. The most important question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. What is the benefit of the addiction? What did it do for you?" And so on. I know in internal family systems, Dick Schwartz also teaches that addiction is like the protector for the person, right? Their exile is in pain, and the addiction comes along, the use of drugs or any other kind of addictive behavior, and it's meant to be the protector against the pain that the exile part of self is experiencing. So kind of being able to reframe this is really important in the new way that we are approaching trauma and addiction, right? Being able to see that the client sees their drug and alcohol use or any other behavioral disorder in that way, addictive disorder, as their help. It's the thing that makes them have a little bit of relief. And that's why it is so difficult to give up, because eventually, absolutely, the brain does get wired in that way. And it is very, very difficult, of course, to change the wiring that has now occurred. Okay. And I'd like to show you two little YouTubes here now. This first one, what is addiction? And in my mind, this one, as moving as it is what I feel is more attached to the older way of looking at addiction, even though it is still absolutely currently happening. Okay, we'll just look at this for a minute. Okay. Stop the share here. Share. Oh, no. So sad. But I think we should process it a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And then just click here. Just click.
Okay. Okay. So that's pretty powerful, right? Does anybody want to comment briefly on that, how sad that is, and what you felt as you were watching that, or write in the chat? I know I needed a couple of minutes after I first saw that to really think what it was doing to my understanding. Anybody like to share anything?
Roseann, it definitely speaks to the progression of addiction, right?
I mean,
Oh
absolutely.
my God, it's just like oh, the flying high and then,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I don't think it's something I would want to show my clients, to tell you the truth. But I think it's important for us who are training, and who work with people who are suffering like this, to have this felt sense of what it's like, if we haven't experienced it ourselves. Yeah, thank you, Ava. Okay. Right, anybody else? Any thoughts about it? Definitely, for me, it was a different way to experience the DSM-5 criteria, right? To feel it in a different way. It's one thing to read these things, it's another thing to feel it in a different way. Okay, all right. And now I'd like to show us another video, and this is about Gabor Mate saying addiction is not a choice, and how addiction, let me just move this here. Addiction has so many different aspects to it: biological, neurological, right? Psychological, medical, emotional, social, political, economic, spiritual underpinnings, and maybe even others he said that he hasn't even thought about yet. So let's just watch this little video as well, and then we'll go on to go a little bit deeper into this, okay?
My mantra on addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. If you want to look at what causes addiction, you have to look at the benefit of addiction. What did it do for you?
It's this one. Sorry, it'll just be a minute. We're actually working in
My
two
mantra
different
on
rooms
addiction
here,
is not why the addiction,
back and
but
forth
why the
on
pain.
different
If you want to
screens, so
look
it's a
at
little
what
bit
causes addiction,
complicated.
you have to look at the benefit of addiction. What did it do for you? People say, typically, it gave me pain relief, escape from stress, it gave me a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. The addiction met some essential human need that otherwise wasn't met in that person's life. So all of these states of lacking connection, of being isolated, of having pain, of having too much stress in your life, these are states of emotional pain. And when you look at populations of
Yeah,
addicts, what you find is
I'm
that
being asked to ask,
more
can you see the
adversity comes.
video?
No, we can't see the video.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, we can just go ahead. It's all right. Okay.
There it is.
You can see it now. Okay.
My mantra on addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. If you want to look at what causes addiction, you have to look at the benefit of addiction. What did it do for you? People say, typically, it gave me pain relief, escape from stress. It gave me a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. The addiction met some essential human need that otherwise wasn't even met in that person's life. So all of these states of lacking connection, of being isolated, of having pain, of having too much stress in your life, these are states of emotional pain. And when you look at populations of addicts, what you find is that the more adversity in childhood, exponentially, the greater the risk of addiction. Which doesn't mean that every person traumatized will become an addict, but it does mean that every addict was traumatized. In my opinion, an addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and does not give up or cannot give up despite those negative consequences. Tobacco, alcohol, substances of all kinds. It could also be related to sex, gambling, shopping, eating, work. Virtually any area of human activity can become addictive depending on the person's relationship to it. I had two major addictions in my life. One was to work, and I also had an addiction to shopping, in my case for classical music, CDs. One day I spent $8,000 on compact discs. It doesn't matter how many sets of a particular composer's symphonies you already have. You have to get the next one and the next one. In the grip of the shopping fever, I once left patient in labor and actually went downtown to get a disc, and I missed the delivery. That's how impactful it was. Now, you may think that's laughable. How can you compare your addiction to those of your heroin-addicted patients? My heroin-addicted patients, when I told them about my addictions, they didn't laugh, or they shook their heads and they said, "Yeah, doc, we get it. You're just like the rest of us." Well, the point is that we're all just like the rest of us. The greatest myth on addiction, number one, that is genetic. Now, it does run in families, but why does it run in families? If I'm an alcoholic and if I yelled and screamed at my kids, and then they grow up to soothe themselves with alcohol, did I pass that on to them genetically? Or is that a behavior they developed because I recreated the same conditions that I grew up in? Now, there might be genetic predisposition, but a predisposition is not the same as a predetermination. The other myth around addiction is that it's a choice that people make. And the whole legal system is based on the idea that people are choosing to be addicts. Let's punish them for it so as to deter others. Addiction is not a choice anybody makes, it's a response to emotional pain. The other myth is that addiction is restricted to the substance user or to a few losers in our society. It's rife and rampant through our culture. You would think that with the utter failure of most treatment modalities when it comes to addiction, we would wake up and ask ourselves, do we really understand this condition? But that doesn't seem to happen. We're not looking at its real nature as a response to human suffering, because really not helping people work through and resolve their traumas. So we keep saying, what's wrong with you? Instead of asking, what happened to you?
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.
Okay. So again, these are some of the, the forward-thinking kinds of thoughts for us to have as we move forward, working with those that are suffering from trauma and addiction. I'm going to go through quickly some of the next slides because in the interest of time, we do want to have a few minutes left at the end. So these are just some questions that you want to ask yourself in terms of, what we started out at the beginning of what do I believe addiction is, what do I believe trauma is? Is it a brain disease? Is it irreversible? Is it a result of a habit, a choice, and so on? Those who still believe it's a moral issue, and if it's not a disease, what is it? And can addiction be cured? The DSM-5, as you all know, underwent lots of changes, and from previous versions of the DSM. The first one was like addiction is a personality disorder. Well, we've come a long way since then, and there are 11 criteria. I'm not going to go through them because I'm sure you know what they are and you can look them up as well. The 11 criteria and the 3 levels of severity that the DSM now has. We're not using the word dependent anymore. We're not using the word addiction anymore. In this DSM-5, we're using the word substance use disorder with different levels of severity. So it could be either a mild level of severity, moderate, or more severe, depending upon the number of those 11 criteria you have. And just to go quickly over the new definition of addiction, in 2019, ASAM wrote, addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and continue despite harmful consequences. Here's the good news. Prevention efforts and treatment approaches for addiction are generally as successful as those for other chronic diseases. So we're really getting to that place where the treatment is possible and can be successful. And those old thoughts about, once an addict, always an addict, don't have to fill our minds or become a belief system of those that we're trying to help. Okay, a quick word on harm reduction as another treatment modality for substance use disorders. Harm reduction is a misunderstood health intervention, says Mark Tyndall. And Melissa Byers, harm reduction connects, and connection is needed more than ever. And places that provide harm reduction provide a sense of safety and agency, connect people with resources, become a place where the returning users can be listened to and understood, and feeling absolutely that substance use is a health issue and needs to be taken care of to keep these people safe, to allow them to survive so that they can get the help that they need. Okay, so that's another new thing to focus on and get more deeply involved with an understanding of how harm reduction can be used as a treatment option as well. And finally, the idea of shame, which is at the core of trauma and addiction. And Chris Germer, who teaches mindful self-compassion and many other things, he describes shame as the wish to be loved. And I found that very, very powerful. If shame is at the core of trauma and shame is at the core of addiction, what is needed is love. And that sounds so simple, but it's not. It's so complex. When people feel that they are not worthy of love anymore, they don't deserve love, and they run away from love because love has hurt them in the past. If I can read this quickly because I feel it's so powerful. Shame and the wish to be loved is underneath trauma and addiction. We need to be loved. We needed to be loved. We were born and we still need to be loved. And the wish to be loved never ends. And most of us have actually forgotten the universal wish to be loved, he says. Do you see in my eyes the wish to be loved? It's there, and it's there all the time. And it's not just there for me, it's there for you, and it's there for your family members and your friends, right? But we've forgotten. Most of us have forgotten, and we put it out of our minds. And we've forgotten the wish to be loved because sometimes love hurts too much to remember. We remember that we wanted to be loved and maybe we weren't. So it becomes painful to think about letting love, back into our lives again. Shame is the belief that there is something wrong with us that makes us unlovable. And we are too flawed. We are too frozen to be accepted by others just as we are. And when we look deeply at the nature of shame, we see that we would never feel shame if we also didn't wish to be loved. So it's actually the innocent wish to be loved that sustains shame. So what is needed? Absolutely relationship, connection to self and connection to others through compassion, caring, restorative healing practices that will help bring forth again to a person a sense of resiliency and allow them to have their inner resources. Compassion is a very strong antidote to trauma and to shame. Another great teacher, Alma, said, only when compassion is present Will people allow themselves to see the truth? You need to feel that whoever we are working with, right, as a client who comes in a very brave way to come and get the help that they need, this is what they need, the compassionate healing so that they can relax and tell their truth, and all can be understood and worked with gently, according to the client's pace, allowing for change one step at a time. This is what increases their resilience. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. With self-compassion and compassion, we can help clients uncover all their inner resources and feel a sense of safety again in their own body and in the world around them, feeling that they can once again find a place and a space that they can call their own. Okay. I'm just about out of time. And so I would just invite you to think back on the thoughts that you had as we began this class. And has anything been added, changed? Any new information that you can apply to your work, to yourself, to others? And I'm ending this with the thought from the book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. So you know all of me, asked the boy. Yes, said the horse. And you still love me? Right? We love you all the more. Okay, we made it to the end.